August 9, 1978, a fully loaded Olympic Airways Boeing 747-200, call sign Flight 411, sat baking on the tarmac at Alicon International Airport in Athens, Greece. The temperature had soared to 43 degrees Celsius, 109 degrees Fahrenheit. The air shimmered with heat, and inside the aircraft, 398 passengers and 20 crew members prepared for departure to New York City's JFK Airport. The flight was Olympic's crown jewel, their most prestigious long-haul route, flown aboard their flagship jumbo jet, Olympic Zeus. This was no ordinary flight. It was packed with American tourists returning home. It carried nearly 140 to 150 tons of fuel, sat near maximum takeoff weight, and was about to depart from a city surrounded on three sides by mountains, with a bustling metropolis directly ahead. But just moments after takeoff, Flight 411 would suffer a catastrophic engine failure, compounded by mechanical limitations and procedural breakdowns. Standard Boeing protocols offered no solutions. Simulators couldn't replicate a successful outcome, and by all technical standards, the plane should have crashed into downtown Athens. But it didn't, because one man, Captain Siphis Megadis, broke the rules and saved 418 lives. This is Inside Aero Disaster. To understand what made Olympic Airways Flight 411 such a deadly gamble, you have to understand Alicon Airport. At the time, Alicon was Athens' main international hub, but geographically, it was a nightmare. The airport sat in what locals called Licanopedia, a term meaning wash basin, because it was surrounded by mountainous terrain on three sides. The only safe escape route for a heavy aircraft in trouble? Out over the sea to the southwest. But on runway 33 right, which pointed straight toward the city center, that route wasn't always available, especially during noise abatement departures, which required an immediate left turn out to sea. Any failure to climb properly meant disaster for those on the ground. That day, the odds were already stacked against the crew. The air was hot and thin, severely reducing engine performance. The aircraft was fully loaded with passengers, cargo, and transatlantic fuel. Engine number 2 had just undergone maintenance and was restricted to 96% thrust instead of the full 110%. The plane relied on a rarely used system called the water glycol injection system, designed to boost engine thrust by cooling the combustion chamber with a high-pressure alcohol-water mix. This system could push thrust from 46,150 to 47,670 pounds per engine, buying just enough performance to get a heavy aircraft off the ground in tough conditions. But the system was delicate, complicated, and unreliable. If the valves failed to close properly during shutdown, if one of the pumps failed to pressurize correctly, or if a switch was thrown the wrong way, the system could fail and the result would be catastrophic. Captain Siphis Megadis, an ex-fighter pilot with a steely reputation, was in command. By his side, First Officer Kostas Fikardos, a close friend and seasoned pilot. Flight Engineer Tribos, managing the aircraft's complex systems from the third seat. As the aircraft taxied into position just before 2 p.m., Tribos activated the water glycol system, arming it for takeoff. All 4 green lights illuminated. Everything appeared normal. Then the aircraft began its takeoff roll. As the jet rumbled down the runway, it pushed against physics itself, fighting extreme heat, maximum weight, and reduced thrust. Slowly it passed V1, the speed at which rejecting the takeoff was no longer possible. Then came VR, rotation. Captain Megadis pulled back on the yoke. The nose lifted, and then, boom! A thunderous explosion ripped through the cabin. Engine number 3, the inboard right engine, violently disintegrated, throwing flaming debris across the tarmac and even into surrounding homes. Passengers in the back saw the fire. In the cockpit, no one knew exactly what had happened. Flight attendant Lucia Siechu called the forward galley. "We are screwed." "I know," came the reply. Now airborne, barely, the aircraft faced a triple threat. One engine gone, one engine at reduced power, and potentially no water glycol boost. In the chaos, it's believed that the flight engineer may have mistakenly turned the thrust augmentation system off instead of confirming it was on, or it failed entirely due to valve malfunction. Either way, the extra thrust they were relying on was gone. The 747 now had insufficient power to climb. And ahead, Pan's Hill, a 200-foot-tall barrier less than a mile away. Downtown Athens loomed just behind it. Following Boeing's emergency protocols, the crew should have kept the landing gear extended until reaching a safe altitude. Gear retraction mid-emergency added drag as the gear doors opened and closed, a dangerous delay in such a fragile climb. But Megadis knew the rules wouldn't save them. He gave the order. "Gear up, now!" Ficardos hesitated, then obeyed. The gear began to retract. Drag momentarily increased. Airspeed dropped. But it worked. Barely. The aircraft scraped past Pan's Hill with only 9 feet of clearance. Just 9. And still, the danger was far from over. Flight 411 had just survived the impossible takeoff. Now it faced something worse. Skimming over rooftops, falling speed, rising terrain, a city of millions beneath. 9 feet. That's how close Olympic Airways Flight 411 came to disaster just seconds after takeoff. Barely clearing Pan's Hill, a 200-foot elevation straight ahead of the runway. But that miracle came at a cost. To make the climb, Captain Sifis Megadis had traded speed for altitude. Now he had to do the opposite. The 747 was low, too low, and getting slower. "Drop the nose!" Megadis made the call. They needed airspeed urgently. Without it, the massive aircraft would stall and fall out of the sky. He traded 50 feet of altitude for about 6 knots of speed. It wasn't much, but it kept them flying. Below, the rooftops of southern Athens flashed by. In neighborhoods like Kallithea, people stared out of their windows, eye level with the aircraft. Flight attendant Lucia Siachu would later recall seeing the stunned faces of office workers as the plane rumbled past 14-story buildings, just feet above the rooftops. Some passengers even believed this was a sightseeing detour. They lifted their cameras and snapped pictures, completely unaware that they were moments away from becoming part of aviation history, or a death toll in the thousands. But in the cockpit, reality was brutal. Engine number 3 was gone. Engine number 2 was underpowered, and the water glycol boost system had either failed or been misconfigured. The aircraft had lifted off, but it was not flying safely. It was dragging itself across the city with just enough power to avoid collapse. Captain Megadis was calm, but grim. "We were considered dead," he later said. It was over. He knew there was no way to turn back immediately, and with downtown Athens ahead, there was no space to descend. So he made a second fateful decision. If we're going down, we'll crash on the mountain. Mount Aigaleo, a rugged ridge just west of Athens, was one of the few areas sparsely populated enough to absorb a crash without massive ground casualties. Megadis instructed the crew to prepare for an emergency descent and crash landing. He wasn't planning to save the plane. He was trying to minimize death, but fate wasn't finished. 3 unexpected things happened, just in time. First, the aircraft left the core of the city. The ground temperature dropped and the air density increased, slightly improving lift. Second, a southwest sea breeze kicked in, giving the 747 a mild but critical headwind to work with. And third, in the middle of the chaos, flight engineer Tribos managed to restore engine optimization. By manually adjusting the fuel flow and settings, he squeezed additional thrust out of the 3 remaining engines. It wasn't much, but in aviation, sometimes inches and knots make the difference. Airspeed crept up, from 158 to 164, 170, 180 knots. At last, the 747 reached a critical threshold. Safe climb speed. The aircraft, still frighteningly low, began to climb gently. Now at 300 feet, Captain Megadis took another risk. He retracted the flaps slightly, a move that would increase aerodynamic efficiency and reduce drag. The climb stabilized. When the aircraft reached 1,500 feet, the captain began dumping fuel, reducing the aircraft's weight dramatically. The 747 responded almost instantly, gaining height and range. With Athens behind them and the sea ahead, Olympic Zeus was finally flying for real. In the cabin, few passengers understood what had just happened. The roar of the engines, the unusual takeoff path, the shock of seeing office workers through their windows. But there had been no screams, no alarms, only one man and his team, making impossible decisions under impossible pressure. With Athens finally behind them, Olympic Airways Flight 411 emerged from the jaws of one of the most dangerous takeoffs in aviation history. The 747 was now over open water. Altitude slowly increasing. Weight decreasing as fuel was dumped. But the crew knew they weren't safe yet. Captain Sifis Megadis, still razor-focused, had to make a new decision: turn around or keep climbing. His gut said the danger was easing. The engines, though limited, were responding better. The air was cooler over the sea, and for the first time since rotation, the aircraft was behaving like a jetliner again. But they were still overweight, still carrying the scars of a mid-air explosion, and still flying without full thrust. So Megadis chose caution. They would circle, burn more fuel, dump more weight, and give the plane the best chance possible to return safely. Fuel jettison continued as the aircraft climbed to a safer cruising altitude. Flight engineer Tribos closely monitored the engines, making micro-adjustments to fuel flow, bleed air, and pressure ratios. His earlier correction had bought them time. Now it was buying them control. As the aircraft circled out beyond the Attica Peninsula, the crew assessed the systems. The water glycol system had failed or had been mistakenly disabled. Engine number 3 was gone, its absence causing drag and imbalance. The landing gear had already been retracted early, a bold decision that had likely saved the flight. Flaps were now partially retracted, helping to maintain climb efficiency. In short, the aircraft was flying, but only because of decisive action outside the rulebook. Meanwhile, on the ground, Alicon Airport had gone into full emergency mode. Fire crews, ambulances, and medical teams waited. ATC coordinated airspace to allow Flight 411 full priority on approach. They were told to expect an overweight landing, not ideal but better than a crash. Even now, Boeing engineers reviewing early telemetry data were stunned. What they saw didn't make sense. By every performance model they had, the plane should have stalled, should have descended uncontrollably, should have impacted Athens within minutes. Instead, it was holding altitude and turning back to land. As Flight 411 approached the coast again, it looked like just another airliner on final approach. But inside that cockpit, tension remained. A heavy aircraft with asymmetric thrust and structural damage is always a risk on landing. The flaps were re-extended, the gear was lowered, the controls were responsive, and then touchdown. The 747 landed smoothly, rolling to a stop without incident. There was no tire blowout, no fire, no injuries. All 418 people on board walked away. The aircraft, battered but intact, was towed off the runway and shut down. It had taken sheer skill, bold defiance of procedure, and split-second decisions, but the impossible had been done. In the coming hours, passengers realized how close they had come. News began to spread, crew interviews trickled out, but the public still didn't fully understand how severe the situation had been. Not yet. Back on the ground, the passengers of Olympic Airways, Flight 411 were escorted calmly off the plane. Most had no idea how close they'd come to dying. To them, it was just a loud boom, a slightly odd flight path, maybe a bit of turbulence. But in the cockpit, and now in aviation circles across the world, shock was setting in. What the crew of Flight 411 had just pulled off shouldn't have been possible. When Boeing got hold of the flight data, they were stunned. The aircraft had taken off at or near maximum takeoff weight in extreme heat, 43 degrees Celsius, 109 degrees Fahrenheit. With engine number 2 throttled down to 96% due to recent maintenance, with engine number 3 exploding just after liftoff, and with the water glycol thrust augmentation system likely non-functional due to failure or crew error. By the numbers, this was a fatal combination. Their engineers input the flight data into training simulators, trying to recreate what Captain Megadis had done. Every time the aircraft stalled and crashed, they adjusted timing, retried decisions, altered control inputs. Same result, crash after crash. It wasn't just incredible, it was unexplainable by normal standards of flight performance. Olympic 411 had defied standard takeoff procedure, retracted gear prematurely, overridden Boeing's own engine-out protocols, cleared a rising hill by just 9 feet, and flown through urban airspace at rooftop height without stalling. It wasn't that Boeing's procedures were wrong. They were built for predictability, but this wasn't a predictable flight. He broke every rule, one engineer allegedly said, and it worked. There's a reason the 747 simulators couldn't recreate the outcome, because simulators are built around normal human reaction times, textbook techniques, and approved procedures. Captain Siphias Magadis didn't follow the book. He rewrote it in real time. But despite the magnitude of what had happened, there was no official investigation. At the time, Greece lacked an independent air accident investigation authority, and since the plane landed safely, there was no formal crash to investigate. There was no final report, no global safety bulletin, no FAA-level incident debrief. For some, that was a relief. For others, and especially the pilots, it was frustrating. Because this wasn't just a lucky save, it was a textbook-changing event that could have improved global emergency protocols. Instead, it became a quiet legend, passed along in briefings, told in crew rooms, and studied in simulator sessions. Still, word spread quickly in the aviation world. Other pilots heard what happened. Engineers pored over the data. Olympic Airways took another look at its own procedures. And Captain Magadis, he carried a copy of the flight data with him everywhere he went, not out of pride, but because so few people believed his story until they saw the numbers. They believed it was exaggeration until they saw what that plane did, until they tried it themselves, and failed. Flight 411 became one of the most quietly respected miracles in commercial aviation. Known among pilots, rarely mentioned in the press, but taught as an example of instinct over instruction, Olympic Airways, Flight 411 landed. No one died. There was no debris field, no official headline-making crash. But those facts almost make the story easier to overlook. And yet, this flight became one of the most extraordinary escapes in aviation history. 418 people had survived a takeoff under conditions that should have ended in flames. The plane had lost an engine, lacked the thrust boost it relied on, and was flying in one of the worst imaginable environments. Maximum weight, crippling heat, urban terrain. But one man at the controls refused to freeze, hesitate, or follow the rulebook into disaster. Captain Siphias Magadis is remembered by many who knew him as calm, sharp, and fiercely focused. A former fighter pilot with thousands of hours in commercial aviation, he wasn't known for recklessness. He was known for precision under pressure. And in the defining moment of his career, he did what few would dare. He retracted the landing gear early. He lowered the nose to trade altitude for speed. He chose to fly toward a mountain rather than into a city, and he ordered every move with full acceptance of what might come next. These decisions were all in direct violation of Boeing's procedures. They were risky. They could have made things worse, but they worked, and they saved hundreds. The story of Flight 411 is often described as a miracle of instinct, but that underplays the reality. It wasn't luck, it was skill, courage, and bold defiance of protocol when protocol had no answers. And though there was no formal investigation, the aviation community learned from it. That human judgment is sometimes the last, best line of defense. That checklists and procedures must evolve to account for rare but survivable edge cases. And that heroism in the sky doesn't always come with medals or headlines. Flight 411 is a haunting reminder of how thin the margin between life and death can be in aviation. Had the gear not been retracted, had the crew hesitated for even 3 seconds, had the engineer not recovered engine balance, had they struck a rooftop instead of clearing it by inches, there would be no story, only wreckage and grief. Years later, when asked about that flight, Captain Magadis never boasted. He simply referred to it as the day we were supposed to die. But thanks to him and his crew, no one did. What Captain Magadis did on August 9, 1978, wasn't about breaking the rules. It was about understanding that sometimes survival means thinking beyond the manual, that sometimes in aviation, the only thing more dangerous than risk is hesitation. Olympic Airways Flight 411 will never be forgotten by those who lived it. and it should never be forgotten by anyone who steps into a cockpit today. Because when systems fail, courage and instinct take over, and sometimes breaking the rules is exactly what saves lives. If this story left you speechless, imagine living through it. Hit that like button if you're in awe of what Captain Megadis pulled off. Subscribe to Inside Aero Disaster for more unbelievable true stories from the skies. See you in the next one.